Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Okay, welcome to this edition of the GSMC Car Podcast. Today we are going to be talking about one of the best cars, if not the best car, America has ever produced. And it is not a specific car, it is rather a platform of cars. This, my friends, is the Ford Panther Platform, America's best vehicle, Detroit's best iron, America's most reliable car, whatever you want to call it. This is the Ford Panther Platform. This is a legendary vehicle or platform for vehicles that has been produced. Essentially, what we're going to be talking about, what is the Panther Platform. We're going to be talking about some of the most popular cars built on the Panther Platform. We're going to talk about the Ford Crown Victoria. We are going to be talking about the Mercury Grand Marquis, the Mercury Marauder, and the Lincoln Town Car. Those are the most famous cars that have ever been built on the Ford Panther Platform. Those are the ones that you are most likely to still see today on the roads, considering the fact that they were just went out of production about less than a decade ago. And we're going to be discussing my personal thoughts on the Ford Panther Platform if you stay tuned to the very end. So why don't we get started? I'm very excited to talk about the Ford Panther Platform because even though personally I'm a GM person, I prefer Cadillac, Buick, Chevy, and things of that sort. It is an undeniable fact that the Ford Panther Platform is probably the best American car ever made, regardless of anything that ever came from GM. And that's saying a lot because I'm a diehard GM fan. I've never driven a Ford product. I've only ever had GM cars. But, you know, the Ford Panther Platform is the real deal, folks. So, Ford Panther Platform was produced from 1978 to 2011. It was Ford's full-size, body-on-frame, rear-wheel drive sedan platform. This is the real deal. This is the traditional American sedan. And you might have heard about this months ago in my traditional American luxury podcast. What I meant by what was traditional American luxury, what was the traditional American sedan. So you will find that, there will be a tiny bit of overlap in those two episodes because I mentioned the Ford Panther Platform in that episode. This was largely considered the last sedan of its kind, the death of the body-on-frame passenger car. These days, you will be hard-pressed to find a sedan that is a body-on-frame construction and that is a rear-wheel drive. I don't think they exist anymore. I think the Ford Panther Platform was the last of its kind when it went out of production in 2011. This was the longest produced platform in the North American automotive history. This platform was produced from 1978 to 2011, folks. That is 33 years. This is 1/3 of a century. That is the longest any car platform had ever been produced in the North American market. It is a record that I doubt will be beaten anytime soon. That's how quintessential the Ford Panther platform was to American car culture, American car everything, was the fact that it was produced for 33 years. I mean, you can't get rid of something like that. It's like Ford really adopted, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They really adopted that mentality. And honestly, to tell you the truth, I'm very glad that they did. The Ford Panther platform outlived the GM and D body by 15 years and outlived Chrysler's last full-size traditional land yacht by 33 years. So it outlived Chrysler's last traditional car, which was the Chrysler New Yorker. I believe that was downsized after the 1978 model year. So it outlived the Chrysler platform for as long as it was in production, by 33 years. That's insane. I mean, Chrysler, after about 1978, when they were forced to downsize all their cars because of the growing concern in fuel economy and because of the fuel crisis, I mean, the Chrysler full-size sedans didn't last long. The GM sedans were able to hold out until the 90s, and then the Ford sedans, I mean, were able to hold out until 2011, and they were still updating them. They were still, putting facelifts. It's not like they left them alone. Like, they were actually making money off of these things. The Ford Panther platform is well known as the go-to fleet model for police cars, taxis, and limousine companies. In America, it's hard pressed to find someone who doesn't recognize a Lincoln Town car or a Ford Crown Victoria. You might get people who don't recognize the Mercury Grand Marquis, and that's understandable because Mercury Grand Marquis weren't used as police cars. They weren't used as a basis for limousines. But it will be hard pressed to find someone who doesn't know, they may not know the name of the car, but someone who doesn't know what it looks like or who has never heard the term Crown Victoria or who doesn't know what a Lincoln Town car is. That's how commonplace these cars are. Like, when I started driving, I was always just, it was like a sixth sense to watch out for Ford Crown Victorias because 9 times out of 10, they were police cars. Now, part of me is kind of sad because now the police cars, the vast majority of them are Dodge Chargers or Ford Explorers. They are no longer Ford Crown Victorias. Every once in a while, you get a Ford Crown Victoria that's held out over the years. But they're really starting to change, and that's kind of becoming sad. But, I mean, even the limousines are still Lincoln Town cars. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, hearses, Lincoln Town cars, limousines, Lincoln Town cars. All of these are B-body cars. I mean, not B-body cars. B-body is GM. All of these are Panther platform cars. It's amazing how much of a staple they are to American car culture. Let's see. Let's move on. Just like I said, one of the most recognizable cars ever produced here in America. They were infinitely reliable and built tough. Police swore by their reliability. These were able to keep up with high-speed chases. These things, you've seen how rugged these things are. Like, police would drive them up, down. Like, it was insane. These cars handled abuse so well. They were champions of reliability, champions of durability. You heard about how the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost was the best car of its day. I mean, the Ford Panther platform is one of the best cars ever produced. Not only just in America, but in the world. I tell you, it's insane how much these things were able to handle. Taxis would regularly still be taking fares and being used daily after several 100,000 miles. You go to New York and you find taxis. I mean, some of those taxis are 5, 6, 700,000 miles. And I'm not talking about 50, 60, 70,000 miles. I'm talking about 5, 6, 700,000 miles. And these things are running just fine. They run like tops because they are built infinitely well. And like, they require very basic maintenance. That Ford modular V8 body on frame rear wheel drive. I mean, you hit the car, all you have to do is, lift off the body, take out the dent, and then slap the body back on. I mean, my friend Shannon, her mother had one. It was a 1998 Lincoln Town car. This wasn't a Ford Crown Victoria, but a Panther platform nonetheless. She got T-boned by a pickup truck and walked away from that car accident as if though nothing happened. Yeah, she was bruised, but she got walked. And you know what she was going to do? She was going to take out a loan so she can get her car fixed because she loved her car that much. And the car would have been able to do it too, except the frame was cracked and there was nothing that they could do. But imagine that. If that was in a unibody car, she would have been dead. I mean, these things were safe. They were reliable. They were rugged. It was insane. I mean, it was insane how well built this Ford product was. I mean, if nothing else, if Ford ever goes out of business one day, they will be remembered for their Ford Panther platform as the best car they have ever made and one of the best cars on earth. I mean, I cannot stress that enough. There were several cars built on the Ford Panther platform. Vast majority of them were sedans, a couple of coupes in there, and a couple of station wagons, which were basically just variations of the sedans that they were based off of. So for Ford, you had the Ford LTD. You had the Ford LTD Crown Victoria, Ford Country Squire, Ford Crown Victoria, Ford Crown Victoria Police Interceptor. For Mercury, you had the Mercury Marquis. You had the Mercury Colony Park. You had the Mercury Grand Marquis. You had the Mercury Marauder. That is the third generation of the Mercury Marauder. And for Lincoln, you had the Lincoln Continental Mark VI, and Lincoln Town Car. Essentially, those were the cars that were built on the Ford Panther platform. You will find that most of them are sedans, some of them are station wagons, but the Ford Panther platform, I'm still not done ranting about it. I mean, they weren't particularly glamorous cars. The most glamorous cars that were ever built on the platform were probably the Continental Mark VIs. I mean, those were probably the most expensive, the most luxurious. And even those by international standards, by that time, standards had begun to wane. I mean, American luxury cars didn't have the same cachet that they used to. They were just American land yachts. I mean, Ford was so determined to keep these cars. When they were taxing cars for gas guzzler tax, American cars for gas guzzler tax, Ford moved production of these cars to Canada and then considered them imports so that they would be exempt from gas guzzler tax. That's how Ford was able to get away with producing them for so long, because Ford knew that they had a gold mine and that they couldn't afford to be taxed with gas guzzler tax because of how important these cars were to vehicle sales for them. I mean, these were some of the best selling cars in America before Panther platform. Any variation of it. I mean, the Ford LTD at some point was the Ford Crown Victoria. I mean, it was the predecessor to the Ford Crown Victoria as we know it. These Ford LTDs were found anywhere and everywhere. I mean, the Ford LTDs were found so often, goodness, that even though your Ford LTD today is a classic car, your Ford LTD probably ain't worth much more than my right foot. I mean, like, it's not worth anything. Because they were that common. It was amazing. It was amazing. They outsold far more than almost any other thing that GM ever could have offered. I mean, GM offered the B-body, but guess what? The B-body stopped production in 1996. I mean, the Panther platform lived on 15 years later. Now, it went to a point where it was unchallenged in that sort of territory, body on frame, rear wheel drive, V8 powered sedan. I mean, Cadillac still had the DeVille, but the DeVille has moved to a front wheel drive platform. Chrysler was out of the traditional American luxury game for a while. They had the cab over design, then they had the 300, but Chrysler was out of that for a while. So GM's main rivals against the Ford Panther platform were all front wheel drive cars. Yes, they were long, and they were like the Neo land yachts, but they were not land yachts because they were front wheel drive, transverse mounted engines, unibody construction. I mean, they couldn't hold a candle to the old body on frame cars from before. I mean, not to say that they were terrible, but it wasn't the same sort of car. Like, Ford soldiered on unencumbered by car downsizing into the modern era with these cars, and people still bought them, despite the fact that the sales began to slip. I mean, the sales were so popular anyway that even when they began to slip, I mean, they were still selling very well. It's a quintessential car for the American old person. I mean, how many old people, you go to a church parking lot and count how many Ford Crown Victorias you're going to see. Maybe not a lot because they didn't sell as much, but tell me how many Mercury Grand Marquis you're going to see, and how many Ford, Lincoln Town cars you're going to see. All those Ford Panther platform cars. I mean, you're probably going to come out with, double digits in numbers. Honestly, if you get a big enough parking lot, you might even get into the triple digits. These cars were that common. I mean, this is how much people loved their Ford Panther platforms. But it was amazing. It was amazing. I mean, I can go on and on and on, but please stay tuned for the next segment in which we are going to be discussing the most popular Ford Panther platform car, which is the Ford Crown Victoria. So please stay tuned after the break, folks.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Okay, welcome back, folks, after the break. I hope you enjoyed that. The Ford Crown Victoria. Yeah. In the last segment, we just talked about the Ford Panther platform in general, but we did not go into in depth about one specific car. But I felt like the Ford Crown Victoria was so famous, it deserved its own segment for it to be eulogized, if I could put it that way. I mean, this is a love song. This is a swan song. This is the eulogy for the Ford Crown Victoria. I mean, I get chills just talking about it. This was truly a wonderful car. Moving on. It was used as the basis for police cars and taxis in most of the United States for a considerable amount of time. Even before it became the quote-unquote Ford Crown Victoria, when it was still the Ford LTD, they were still used for police officers and they were still used for taxi drivers. I mean, this is how commonplace they were. They're kind of like the Toyota Crown platform from Japan. Toyota Crowns, I mean, Toyota Crowns are crawling all over Japan. They are used for police cars. They're used for taxis. They're used for this. They're used for that. In fact, the Toyota Crown is so popular that they are still making the Toyota Crown Comfort, and the design really hasn't changed much over the years. This is how, Toyota Crowns are. That Toyota Crown platform is basically like the Japanese Ford Panther platform. But I digress. Though the name Crown Victoria had been in use since the 1950s or not since, but beginning in the 1950s, to denote the top-of-the-line trim of the Ford Fairlane. It went on a hiatus for 23 or so years until it came back as the up-level trim of the Ford LTD in the 1980s. Basically, it started out as many American cars started out as an upper trim level of another car. The DeVille was an up trim level of the Series 62. The Town Car was an up trim level of the Lincoln Continental. The Mercury Grand Marquis was an up level trim of the Mercury Marquis. I mean, it was basically how a bunch of cars started, was that they were up level trims of another, and then they got spun off into their own model. In the 1990s, the Crown Victoria became its own model. Despite being produced from 1991 to 2011, it only spanned 2 generations. So in 20 years, they only had 2 iterations of the Ford Crown Victoria as a standalone model. The first generation, I have to mention this. It was a controversial design. As much as I praise and I laud the Ford Crown Victoria as being the most common Ford Panther platform and as the best selling and the most recognizable, the first generation of the Ford Crown Victoria, I'm just going to put it out there, it was ugly. It was ugly as sin. I mean, it was not pretty. A car that was full size, deserved a proper grille, deserved proper lights, proper everything. It deserved a proper design. The design was not proper. The design was trying to imitate the Ford Taurus. The Ford Taurus was a completely different animal. I mean, it was a crime to treat the car that way. It really was. I mean, they were long and they had squinty headlights and squinty tail lights and no grille up front, and it looked odd. It looked odd. I mean, a futuristic design like that, it should have gone to a car that really deserved it, like the Ford Taurus. I mean, the Ford Panther platform was already antiquated by then. It didn't deserve a refreshed aero design. No. It didn't deserve that. It needed to stay square and boxy, or if it wasn't going to be square and boxy, at least it needed to remain conservative. They took too big of a risk, and the risk didn't work. And a lot of people don't like them. I don't like them, and a lot of people love them. It was a love it or hate it sort of deal. You don't find people who are in the middle about the first generation of the Ford Crown Victoria. Either they love it or they hate it. And I find myself to be one of the ones who hate it. That's my small rant on it. But it was ugly as sin. Yeah. Anyway, it was meant to mimic the design of the Ford Taurus of a similar vintage. The Ford Taurus had come out in the 1980s, and the Ford Taurus had that very aerodynamic, no grill sort of look that worked for it because it was a smaller mid-sized sedan. It could pull that off. It was modern. It was new. It was chic. It was what people were looking for at the time. It wasn't some traditional stuffy old boring sedan like the Crown Victoria was, and frankly, like it should have stayed, because the design didn't do it justice. But this was the first Ford to feature the 4.6-liter modular V8 that was first used in the 1991 Lincoln Town Car. This modular V8, if I could just take a moment to praise it as well. This modular V8 was one of the most reliable engines Ford ever produced. Actually, it's probably the most reliable engine that Ford produced. This is likened to the Buick 3800 engine. They are completely different animals, but the Buick 3800 engine is probably the most reliable GM engine ever produced. The Ford modular V8 is probably the most reliable engine that Ford ever produced. So basically, Ford modular V8 was a V8 longitudinally mounted, which means it was mounted vertically, like long ways, to drive the rear wheels. And it produced, depending on the variation of it, produced a base of around 200 horsepower by the time it became modern and was being put into cars of the late 90s, early 2000s. At some point, it probably only produced like 160, 180 horsepower. But then obviously, as the cars began to age, as cars began to move into the modern era, they gave it more power. This was an extremely reliable engine. It had an overhead camshaft design. I mean, yeah, these were bulletproof. They were bulletproof. I mean, they were simple, no frills to them, and you could swap parts very easily. Parts were extremely easy to find because of how common they were. The definition of a reliable engine. Bulletproof, able to handle abuse, and did what it needed to do without being, asked, without being coaxed. It just did what it needed to do. It was an engine with a sense of duty. It never lets you down, sort of thing. So yeah, that's the 4.6 liter Ford Modular V8. This was the only generation to have the touring sedan option that was offered only in 1992. Now, as much as I say how ugly this generation of Ford Crown Victoria was, I cannot say that for the 1992 Ford Crown Victoria touring car. The touring package, or the touring sedan, I should have called it, was gorgeous. It was a two-tone design, a two-tone paint scheme, only used for that year. Only was special, it was a special option. It was a top-of-the-line option. It was two-tone paint scheme that actually worked with the exterior of the car. I saw one of these on one of the car Facebook pages that I'm part of, and I believe it was like underappreciated survivors. This man saw the car for sale with like ridiculously low miles for only $5,000. And you know what he did? He went over there and he just bought it. He saw it. He took a picture of it. He's like, I have to have this car. It's rare. It's gorgeous. It has been kept meticulously maintained. It was in mint condition, and he bought it, and I'm telling you, the interior was beautiful. It had this dark wood trim. The interior looked surprisingly modern, the colors that they used. It wasn't like some bright tacky color from 80s, 90s interiors. Like this was a proper vehicle, and it looked gorgeous. Just some of the specs of the touring car edition from 1992. It had all the options available that you can get on a Ford Crown Victoria at the time. All of the options available, bar none. Nothing was spared. As well as revised suspension and performance upgrades of the police version. So you get the revised suspension, you get the performance upgrades, the sway bars and other sorts of things that made the police cars handle the way they did, and you get every single luxury feature available. This was the top of the line Ford at the time. It is a shame that they only produced it for the 1992 model year. I could have seen that being so helpful and so smart to keep in the Ford Crown Victoria lineup. Granted, they had a sport version, but it wasn't a touring car package after the 1992 model year. So really, in my opinion, they should have kept it, but nobody listens to my opinion anyway. Second generation was produced from 1998 to 2011, and it was produced in 2012 for Middle East fleet sales. So technically, the Ford Panther platform was produced until 2012, because even though they couldn't be sold in the United States because of changing government regulation, they did not have stability control. And by 2012, all new cars being sold in America had to have stability control, I assume. So the last bid were all sent to the Middle East. So the Ford Crown Victoria, the last Ford Crown Victoria to roll off the assembly line, is traipsing somewhere around the Middle East, but it ain't here in America. In 1998, the Ford Crown Victoria was redesigned on the exterior to a design that was more similar to the Mercury Grand Marquis. This design was really much less polarizing than the aero look of years past. It shared many body panels with the Mercury Grand Marquis. This move towards the design of the Grand Marquis was an effort to offer more conservative styling after the poor reception of the newly redesigned Chevy Caprice, its chief rival. So essentially, to pick that statement apart a little bit, the Chevy Caprice was the main rival against the Ford Crown Victoria from GM. Chevy Caprice had been recently redesigned right around the same time for a more aerodynamic look. Apparently people didn't like it. I'm a Chevy guy. I thought it looked better than the Crown Victoria of the time period, but who do I say and what do I know? So essentially it wasn't well received. Neither was the Buick Roadmaster for their aerodynamic looks. They're trying to implement some curves and some flowing lines into the design. People tend to not like change. People wanted them to stay square and wanted them to stay boxy, and frankly it just wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to work. So people didn't like it, and on top of the fact that sales were slipping for that sort of car anyway, GM decided to pull the plug in 1996. Well, learning from the smart man's mistake, Ford being wise, they decided to change the design, even though they didn't do much to the interior, frankly. They just changed the exterior and made it more conservative, made it more handsome, just like the Mercury Grand Marquis. And they did a very good job because this was the last redesign for the Ford Crown Victoria. From 1998 to 2011, it stayed the same. There were facelifts, there were refreshes. They added a new grille at some point. They redesigned the interior at some point. They reworked the chassis, so the exterior got a minor facelift as well at some point. But really, it wasn't even that different. To the point where the cars from the 90s and the cars from the 2000s, unless you had a very, very, very trained eye, you really could not tell the difference between the two of them. It was that subtle of the changes that they made once they did the major redesign back in 98. It was basically the last hurrah for the Ford Crown Victoria was in 2008. Because the Ford Crown Victoria was so similar to cars like the Mercury Grand Marquis, it didn't really sell well to civilian fleet sales and whatnot. Essentially, the Ford Crown Victoria was, how do I exactly put it? The Ford Crown Victoria was too normal. People didn't care for it. People saw the Ford Crown Victoria more as a fleet vehicle, a workhorse. So in 2008, Ford pulled it from its website. It no longer was selling it to the civilian market. And what they did, actually, they continued fleet sales up until 2011 for the North American market and 2012 for the Middle East. So the Ford Crown Victoria as a car that you could go to a Ford dealership and buy ended in 2008, which was kind of sad. But considering that there was the Lincoln Town Car and the Mercury Grand Marquis, all of them which shared the same platform, weren't that different from each other except for different luxury options. It wasn't that big of a deal because sales were slumping anyway. But please stay tuned for the third segment in which I discuss the Mercury Grand Marquis and the Mercury Marauder, and we hope you stay tuned to the last segment in which I discuss the Lincoln Town Car and obviously my personal thoughts on the Ford Panther platform. So please stay tuned, folks.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Alrighty, folks. Welcome back after the break. Welcome to segment 3. This is when we're going to be discussing the Mercury Grand Marquis. So of all of these cars, actually, that I've discussed, this is probably the longest lived. This started out before the Ford Panther platform even existed. The Grand Marquis was produced from 1975 to 2011. So you've heard about what the Panther platform is, and you've heard about the Ford Crown Victoria. So it's only natural that we move on to the second most, I guess, not the second most common, but, you know, the second car on the platform, the Mercury. If we're talking in terms of price point, we've done the cheapest. Now we're doing the middle ground, and then the most expensive was the Lincoln Town Car. So it started out in 1975 as the Mercury Marquis. So basically the same car. It's not like it was a different car per se. Grand Marquis was just, you know, an up trim level, but it still carried the name Marquis. So from 75 to 2011, from 1975 to 1978, it was not on the Panther platform because, well, frankly, the Panther platform didn't exist at the time. And after 79, it stayed on the Panther platform till the end of its run in 2011. Sad to say, this was the last Mercury ever produced. The last one rolled off the assembly line in January 4th, 2011, thus bringing the Mercury Mark to an end after 72 years. Mercury, let me just eulogize Mercury for a bit. Mercury was sort of Ford's Buick. It was the entry-level luxury cars. Mercury had some pretty interesting cars over the years. The Mercury Cougar was an interesting car. There were other interesting Mercurys. I mean, the Mercury Marauder was always an interesting car. And Mercury, by that point, had really sort of lost its way. I mean, what was it except an in-between from Ford to Lincoln? Ford could have easily absorbed all of its Mercury products as luxury versions of the current Ford products. You had cars of this time period that were the Mercury Milan was just a rebadged Ford Focus. Ford Fusion, I should say. The Mercury Mariner was a rebadged Ford Escape. The Mercury Mountaineer was a rebadged Ford Explorer. The Mercury Grand Marquis was a rebadged Ford Crown Victoria. I mean, Mercury had really lost its way. Even the Mercury Cougar of, you know, when it stopped being produced, by Ford in the early 90s. I mean, it was produced into the 2000s by Mitsubishi, and it shared the same body as the Mitsubishi Eclipse. But I'm talking about the real Mercury Cougar was a rebadged Ford Thunderbird. I mean, they weren't that different from Fords. It got to the point where they could no longer justify keeping the brand alive because they had just become fancy Fords, and not so fancy to be Lincoln, but not unfancy enough to be Ford. They were somewhere in the middle. It couldn't justify keeping it anymore. So by that time, Mercury had become insipid. So yeah, that was basically the end of the Mercury line, and Mercury had been suffering for a few years anyway. I mean, it was time for it to go. From 1975 to 1982, it was the top trim level of the Mercury Marquis, as I've already mentioned. For much of its history, it was functionally identical to the Ford Crown Victoria, only slightly more luxurious. And it became even more painfully obvious that these two were practically the same exact car after Ford redesigned the Crown Victoria in 1998 to make it look more like the Mercury Grand Marquis. I mean, yeah, it was painfully obvious. So much so that people who are not privy to cars sometimes can't tell the difference between the two of them. Why the Mercury Grand Marquis existed? I don't know. I really don't. I'm glad it existed though, because the Ford Crown Victoria just looked too boring. Nobody wanted to buy it. The Mercury Grand Marquis at least looked a bit nicer. Had the chrome trim, had the full width tail lights in the end, in the rear end. I mean, the Mercury Grand Marquis was a lot more desirable than your Ford Crown Victoria, even the Ford Crown Victorias that were made for civilian use. They were just plain, they weren't that pretty, and frankly, they're real rare, and you really can't find them. I can't remember the last time I saw a civilian Ford Crown Victoria. I mean, I've seen Crown Victorias that were owned by civilians that are former cop cars, that are former fleet sale models, but as far as a Ford Crown Victoria that was made brand new from the factory, sold on the lot of a Ford dealership for someone to buy as their personal vehicle, I mean, that I haven't seen that in ages. I mean, that's a rarity. But this is not about the Ford Crown Victoria. We already spoke about that. So the first generation of the proper Grand Marquis was produced from 1979 to 1991. It came in 3 body styles: the 4-door sedan, 2-door coupe, and Mercury Colony Park, a station wagon. Mercury Colony Park was technically not a Grand Marquis station wagon. A Grand Marquis station wagon was a thing. Mercury Colony Park was a thing, but the Mercury Colony Park had wood trim on the outside. That's it. They were the same car. So I'm going to lump in the Mercury Colony Park as the Mercury Grand Marquis station wagon because that's basically what it is. It was like an up trim level of that. It was interesting because you would find that the Ford LTD offer the same sort of things too. Like I said, they've long been siblings, even before the Ford Crown Victoria name was a thing. The Ford LTD and the Mercury Grand Marquis were practically the same car, and it was painfully obvious even then, before the Crown Victoria stepped on the scene. Upon being discontinued, the Grand Marquis was the longest produced Mercury car ever. It was produced from 75 to 2011. So let's see, from 75 to 2000, that's 25 years, 25 plus 11, for 36 years they produced this. During the 36 production run, the design remained almost unchanged for the last 19 years of production. The 2011 model, in fact, actually shared body panels with the 1992 model. That's how similar they were. That's how stubborn Ford was. Never wanted to fully redesign it because Ford was so smart. Ford was like, look, we got something. It works. What ain't broke, don't fix it. So that's basically what their philosophy was for the Grand Marquis. Moving on to the Mercury Marauder. The third generation of the Mercury Marauder was a high-performance version of the Grand Marquis. Now, think of 1994 to 1996 Impala SS. How it was a high-performance version of the Chevy Caprice. Well, the Mercury Marauder is the spiritual successor to that. It makes me real sad that the two never actually got to compete against each other, because that would have been quite the rivalry. Impala SS versus Mercury Grand Marquis, but they didn't exist during the same time period. By the time the Mercury Grand Marquis, Mercury Grand Marquis, Mercury Marauder was put back into production as a high-performance version of the Ford Panther platform, the 96 Impala SS had been out of production for 7 years, from 1996 to 2003 when they started producing the Mercury Marauder in 2003. It had been out of production for 7 years. So they never actually got to rival each other. I'm sure, sales of used Impala SSs, if you could find them, probably served as an alternative to a Mercury Grand Marquis, Mercury Marauder, sorry. But it wasn't a direct competitor. It was only merely a spiritual successor. I wish I had seen them directly compete against each other to see what the sales would have been like. It had 302 horsepower. It had a very, very high-performance version of the Ford Modular VA. I believe this was the same engine used in, like, the Ford Cobra. Don't quote me on that. It had aggressive styling, more similar to the Crown Victoria Police Interceptor. The vast majority of Marauders were sold in black. They had blacked-out grills. Blacked out body panels, so body panels that weren't necessarily blacked out, but they were painted the same color as the rest of the car. They got 18-inch wheels that were 5-spoke in design. They had dual exhaust, chrome-tipped exhaust tips. They had an interior that was made to seat 5 people instead of 6 because the shifter was floor mounted. And this was a serious performance vehicle. I mean, of course, being built on the antiquated Ford Panther platform and even being, I guess, basically being a civilian version of the Ford Crown Victoria Police Interceptor. I mean, this car was still a Ford Panther platform. It's not like this was your Lamborghini killer or anything of that sort. But for people who wanted raw horsepower and bulk and size, I mean, the Mercury Marauder was the car for you. I want a Mercury Marauder so bad, but it's hard to find them. And the ones that you do find, to find one you decent condition, you're going to shell out at least $8 to $10,000, and I'm not in the time of my life where I could just be willy-nilly buying a car for $10,000. But I mean, that's one of the cars that's on my bucket list to own and to drive as a Mercury Marauder because they are just that cool. I mean, and people tune them to get more power out of them because these engines weren't too dissimilar to the ones being offered in Mustangs. They were a bit dissimilar, but not so dissimilar that parts couldn't be swapped between some of them, or at least some parts couldn't be swapped. I mean, the Mercury Marauder was the real deal. Mercury Marauder didn't sell well as the Mercury Grand Marquis. I believe the Mercury Grand Marquis outsold this like some ridiculous amount. I think it was like 18-1 or something. I mean, because old people didn't want the fast car. Oh, that's dangerous, Sonny. We don't need to be going that fast. We as old people. But, the average age of the Mercury Grand Marquis buyer was 69 years old. The average age of the Mercury Marauder buyer was 51. So it achieved what it was trying to do by trying to get younger people into Mercury dealerships. I mean, granted, 51 by no means is young. I'm 22. That's young. But 51 is a lot younger than 69. It's a lot younger than 70. I mean, my dad's 53 and he's still young. I mean, he's not as young as I am. He's middle-aged technically, but these are the types of people that even had enough money to buy a Mercury Marauder brand new off the lot anyway. These were the people who knew that they were getting older, so they wanted a larger car, but because they still had that young streak in them, they wanted to go fast in their larger car. And I believe, even though it was only produced for 2 model years, 2003 and 2004, I believe the Mercury Marauder was a success because they're still being lauded today. They are very much just like the Impala SS of the 1990s and really the Chevy SS of the modern day. But the Chevy SS ironically wasn't a sales success. And I should do another podcast on that because that's actually really interesting. It just shows how much cars have been shifting in recent years, that there was a time the Mercury Marauder could be considered a success because it did what it needed to do, even though it didn't sell as much as they thought it would, but it brought younger people into the dealerships. Our car like that, high performance, full size, rear wheel drive, luxury sedan was considered a success. Whereas nowadays, or at least in just recent times within the past 3-4 years, the Chevy SS was considered a flop, even though it was basically the same formula as that, because the car tastes have shifted over the years. And it's not by no fault of the companies, it's just what the people want. They want crossovers these days. They don't want sedans. They don't want body on frame sedans. They want rear wheel drive sedans either. I don't know what's the problem with people, because I think they're all great, but who am I to say anything? So this is the end of this segment. Please stay tuned for the last segment, in which I discuss the the Lincoln Town Car, and I discuss my personal thoughts on the Ford Panther platform. So please stay tuned.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
All right, welcome back, car lovers. This is the last segment. I wish, honestly, I could do a 5 or 6 segment podcast on the Ford Panther platform, because really 4 segments just doesn't do it justice. Honestly, maybe in a few months' time I might revisit it and talk about the lesser known Ford Panther platform cars, and maybe I might do that. But this is the top of the line. This is the cream of the crop. This is the Lincoln Town Car. This is the one that we're going to be talking about. The Lincoln Town Car has a very long and storied past, because it's been used as a nameplate since the 1950s. But let me not get ahead of myself. The Lincoln Town Car, as its own standalone model, was produced from 1980 to 2011. This was the last traditional American luxury sedan. Let's take a moment of silence. All right. That's your moment of silence for the death of the traditional American luxury sedan. That's a moment of silence that was long overdue for about 9 years now, because, I don't think anybody ever honored the Lincoln Town Car for what it was. It started out as the flagship trim level of the Lincoln Continental. It replaced the Lincoln Continental in 1981 as the full-size Lincoln, while the Continental moved down to the mid-size segment. As a result, the Continental Mark VI sedan, which was the only generation of the Continental Mark series to be offered as a sedan, because even the ones that came before it were Lincoln Continental sedans. They weren't Continental sedans. So this was the first Continental Mark series of the new Mark series, not talking about the Mark III from 58, Mark IV and Mark V in the respect, Mark I in 58, Mark II in 59, and Mark III. Those were the forgotten marks. They redid the naming scheme after that. But as far as the not modern, but the more contemporary Lincoln Mark series, or Continental Mark series, it's confusing. These were the only ones that were produced in a full-size sedan form. So what was I saying? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I got digressed. You see, this is why even years later, trying to discuss what Lincoln did with the Continental versus the Town Car versus the Lincoln Continental, it was crazy. Even years later, it's still confusing people. But yeah, anyway, as a result, the Continental Mark VI sedan, the 1981 Lincoln Town Car, and the 1980 Lincoln Continental were all virtually identical and produced at almost the same time. So you had a time where Lincoln was producing the Lincoln Continental sedan. They were producing the Continental Mark VI sedan, because previously Continentals were coupes. They were not sedans. But for the Mark VI generation, they decided to include a sedan in the lineup. So you had the 1980 Town Car, the 1980 Lincoln Continental that was produced for only 1 year before 1981 came around, and there was a Lincoln Town Car. And then you had the Lincoln Continental from the year before that was built on the same platform as 1981's Lincoln Town Car, because 1979 was the previous generation of the Lincoln Continental, and then 1980 was the only year that this generation of the Lincoln Continental was used under the Lincoln Continental nameplate. Because in 1981, the Lincoln Continental moved down to a mid-size segment as a front-wheel drive car, much like the Cadillac DeVille would do a few years later, from body-on-frame front-wheel, rear-wheel drive to unibody front-wheel drive. The Lincoln made that move first before the Cadillac did. So it's a bunch of confusion at that point, frankly. It was really confusing because you had Lincoln Continental sedan. You had Continental Mark 6 sedan. That was not a Lincoln technically. It was a Continental, but you had the Lincoln Continental. But the way you were able to differentiate them before this was the fact that the Continentals were always coupes. And then the Lincoln Continentals were always sedan, but Continental decided to produce a sedan. So you had a Continental Mark 6 sedan, and then you had a Lincoln Continental, which looked almost exactly the same, except the fact that the Continental had the spare tire bump in the back, and it had opera windows. That was literally it. Every single else thing on the car was exactly the same. And then you had the 81 Lincoln Town Car, which was exactly the same as the 1980 Lincoln Continental, but the Lincoln Continental, without people even fully realizing, was still being sold, but it was being sold as a completely different vehicle that was not related to the others. So that's just a short rant. I just had to explain that because it didn't merit having an entire podcast on it, but I had to explain the muddled origins of the Town Car, because at the time, to make it even more confusing, there was a Lincoln Continental Town Car, which was the top trim of the Lincoln Continental. And the Lincoln Continental Town Car could sometimes come as a coupe, but the Continental was also always a coupe, except for this generation in which it was offered as a sedan too. So theoretically, you could have had a 1980 Lincoln Continental Town Car that was a coupe. That was the exact same car as the Continental Mark 6 coupe, except, once again, opera windows and a spare tire bump in the back. And then this is what it was. Lincoln was so crafty. They offered like 5 different cars that looked exactly the same, and people actually still bought them because of their naming origins. I mean, their naming customs were like, well, this is a Lincoln Town Car. Well, what's the difference between this and a Lincoln Continental? Well, there is no difference, but this is a town car. This is a Lincoln Continental Town Car, and this is a Continental Mark 6 Town Car. Like, it was just, they're all the same car, but because they have slightly different names, they offer different sorts of price ranges for that. It's like, this is the ultimate, like, spirit thing. This is like the ultimate, not spirit fingers, this was ultimate, like, magically disappearing fingers in front of, like, you're just pulling the wool over your eyes. It's just, this was crazy. This was the ultimate marketing scheme, and I mean, it worked. I guess it didn't work for a very long time because, as you can see, Lincoln Continental only lasted as a sedan that was a full size until 1980, and then in 1981 they changed the name to Town Car. Continental moved down, and then Continental as its own nameplate became Lincoln Mark after this generation. So it was no longer Continental Mark 6. It became Lincoln Mark 7 or Lincoln Continental Mark 6. I don't even know. It was confusing. But moving on. Wow, I spent a lot more time on that than I should have. Sorry about that, but I just got fired up about that. The Town Car name wasn't used since the 1950s for the Continental Marks of the 59 and 60 model years. There was a licensed version, actually, produced by a Chinese company called Hongqi. It was called the Hongqi CA7460. This was really interesting. I had no clue this even existed. There's a Chinese Lincoln Town Car out there. And it wasn't like the Chinese taking the design of the Lincoln Town Car and ripping it off. No, this was like a legit, like, license transfer sort of thing, like where they used it under license. They changed the front end to look more like the Hongqi models, and then they changed the rear end to have different tail lights that meet Chinese regulation, and then they slapped a turning signal on the front fender, and they call it a day. That was so expensive, as a matter of fact, as being a car used under license and an imported car technically, that it cost $109,000 in American money to purchase a Hongqi 7460 or whatever from China, from the like WAF company or whatever. It was insane. It was crazy. Buying a Lincoln Town Car for $109,000. That's basically what it was. But hey, American cars have always been expensive abroad. It was the last use of the Town Car name was on the Lincoln MKT as a trim denoted for livery use. That was the last time people ever saw the Town Car name on any product made by Ford. Yeah, and that was the end of the Town Car. It stopped production in 2011, and the last use of the name was on the Lincoln MKT a few years later. This was one of the best-selling luxury cars in America. Much like the Mercury Grand Marquis, go into any church parking lot and then count how many Lincoln Town Cars you see. I bet you're going to get into the double digits at least, even nowadays in the modern day. If you go to a parking lot that is large enough, you might even get in the triple digits. I mean, they are that common still. And the good thing is, this is like the last bit of the segment. I'm going to be talking about my thoughts on the Ford Panther platform. What made the Ford Panther platform so great was its versatility. Very rarely could you have ever found a car that could be used as a taxi, as a police car, as a limousine, as a hearse, as a performance car, as this, as that, and still be that successful. Because at that point, people tend to say, well, why do I have to get this when I could just get that? It's the same car anyway. But people adored the Panther platform so much, and it was marketed in such a way that you couldn't really get people to stop buying them. And it really showed that there was merit to producing cars that people may not have. Let me change that. There was merit to producing cars that weren't very popular anymore, in the sense that they were antiquated and that the car world was moving away from them. It showed that there was merit in keeping some antiquated cars in the market, because some people don't like change. You could never convince me to buy a Lincoln MKS over a Lincoln Town Car. Never, ever, ever. The Lincoln MKS was not as good as the Lincoln Town Car. Was not as good then, is not as good now, and never will be as good. So there was a reason why they kept the Lincoln Town Car, even though Lincoln at some point was offering a more traditional, a more contemporary full-size sedan. They kept the traditional one for undoubtedly the purists. And this is when a car company did something for its users instead of just for the sake of money. Because Ford could have discontinued the Panther platform in the 80s like it was going to originally, but because of such high demand, and because of how great the cars were, I tell you, if they brought out the Panther platform nowadays again, I bet you it would still sell. Because people who love them miss them. They miss them terribly. This was like the old friend that was gone too soon, that moved away, or the grandmother that you could never spend enough time with, and she ended up passing away. No matter how much time you spent with your grandmother, you never felt like you had enough time, and then she ended up passing away. It's a wound that is still struggling to heal in the minds of the traditionalist American car lover. I mean, you know, the B-body is long gone. There are still people who pine for the B-bodies, who pine for the D-bodies of the 90s from GM. But those people who couldn't get those were the ones who went for the Panther platforms after GM dropped the ball on the traditional American sedan. I mean, I still pine for them. And at the time these went out of production, I was in 7th grade. I couldn't even think about car ownership at the time because I couldn't even drive. I was too young. I still pine for them. So that's just to show you what an impact the Ford Panther platform had. The Ford Panther platform was legitimately the best car ever produced in the United States, or for the United States market. Yeah. So that is my tribute to the Ford Panther platform. The Ford Crown Victoria, the Mercury Grand Marquis, Mercury Marauder, and Lincoln Town Car. May they all rest in peace, and may their memories live on forever. So thank you so much for listening to this edition of the GSMC Car Podcast. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. If you liked it, please leave us a like and subscribe on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and tell people about us, and have a good night. And thank you for everything that you do. Thank you for listening because it really helps us. So have a good night, folks. Thank you once again.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.